So section 3.7, solving linear and quadratic systems. Now, like I told you guys, there aren't a lot of notes to this. We are going to kind of just jump into question 1, question 3, etc. But I do want to give you some hints, like things that you need to do in order to make sure you prepped the problem properly. Okay, so just a couple of hints. So number 1, you're going to want to identify the quadratic equation now right here in parentheses. I'm just going to kind of write what those kind of look like. They don't always look like this, but usually it is going to be true that you're going to have an x squared term somewhere. Maybe you don't have an x to the first. Maybe you don't have a normal number like a 7 or a 5 for C. Maybe you don't have that, but you'll always have the x squared term. So that's how you can identify your quadratic. Okay, so identify the quadratic equation and the linear equation. So this is the one that usually will look like this. Maybe not always. Maybe it's going to look like ax plus by equals c, but it's gonna have at the highest an x to the first power. Never going to have x squared, never going to have x cubed. Excuse me. But it will have an x to the first as its highest power. Okay, so identify those. All right, you're going to want to make sure, like, okay, this is my linear, this is my quadratic. You want to make sure you can find those. 2, use the linear equation to substitute into the quadratic equation. So we are going to do substitution. Again, that's a skill that you guys already know how to do. This is what I mean by everything we do today you've done before, but maybe you've never seen it done like this. Okay, so that's what might be new. So use the linear equation to substitute into the quadratic equation. Number 3, solve the quadratic equation. Okay, and I'm going to put right here, usually set it equal to 0. Okay, usually set it equal to 0. Because your equation is going to look really like messy. There's going to be stuff on both sides of the equal sign, so you're going to want to make sure one side says equals 0. Okay? So solve the quadratic equation by setting it equals 0 by either factoring, which is usually my favorite way of doing it, or the quadratic formula. And that's that big formula we talked about yesterday, right? X equals negative b plus or minus square root. It's over there, the red poster on the left side. Really big equation. So that's the one that you can use as well. If you just like, I don't feel like factoring, so I'm just going to plug the numbers in. You can do that, but remember, in order to do that, you have to make sure that it's set equal to 0 first, right? So no matter what, you got to set it equal to 0. Okay? Once you solve the quadratic equation by either factoring or using the quadratic formula, the last step, plug in the x values you solved for into the linear equation. So into the linear equation to find your y values. So plug in the x values that you solve for into the linear equation to find your y values. I know it sounds like a lot of stuff's going on. It's not that bad. But if I just have to give you like a roadmap, like you got to do this first, do this next, do this, etc., that would be what you want to do. Okay, those 4 steps. So go ahead and finish writing that up. I'm going to go over question number 1 with you guys, and then we'll do question 3, And then I think we might be out of time by then, because it is short periods. Now, you'll notice this is substitution. So if you guys remember when I taught substitution to you guys many weeks ago, anytime it was substitution, I always wrote my equations side by side. Whenever it was elimination, I did one on top of the other. I still recommend that for you guys, okay? Because it just makes it easier to work with stuff. So step number 1, they say solve, right? Solve for this. So step 1 that I told you guys was to identify your linear and quadratic equations, right? My quadratic one is on the left. My linear one is on the right. So I'm actually just going to kind of label it here. This is my linear function. Step 2 says use your linear function and plug it into your quadratic function. So you see how my linear function says y is equal to 4x plus 10? I'm going to get that and plug it into there, where the y is. So my equation is now going to look like this. 4x plus 10 is equal to x squared minus 2x minus 6. Okay, so notice now my equation looks really messy. I told you guys this is what's going to happen when you start doing these problems. They start to get kind of messy. Step 3 says to solve for your quadratic equation by factoring or using the quadratic formula. But before you do any of that, in red, I said set it equal to 0, right? So I got to get one of these sides, either the left or the right side, to say 0 on it. So I'm going to move the stuff on the left, the 4x and the 10, I'm going to move it over to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 4x first from both sides. And that's going to give me a 10 equals to x squared minus 6x minus 6. Well, it still doesn't say 0 on either side. So I'm going to get that 10 that's on the left, and I'm going to subtract it on both sides. So on the left side, I have 0, so that's good, equal to x squared minus 6x minus 16. So at this point, it's up to you. Whatever you want to do. You could either factor or you could use the quadratic formula, okay? I like factoring because it's easier for me, but maybe you're like, well, I'm not really great at factoring, so I'm going to use the formula instead, and that's going to find me my answers, okay? Whatever you want to do. No matter which way you pick, you still have to identify your A, your B, and your C term. So my A term, that's in front of the x squared, that's a 1. My B term is a negative 6, and my C term is a negative 16. Now, like I said, I'm going to factor, okay? So let's do X method here. A times C is negative 16. The B goes down here. So now the question is, what two numbers work? 8 and 2. Should they both be positive? Negative 8 and a positive 2. So here we go. Negative 8, positive 2. And remember, you guys have done this before. Like I told you guys earlier, everything we're doing today, you've done before. Maybe just not in this process, but you've done all these steps, okay? So at this point, you're supposed to say, okay, I found my two numbers, negative 8 and 2. So I'm going to write my answer, x minus 8, x plus 2, and it should still be saying equals to 0. So at this point, I don't know if you guys remember me saying this before, but you're going to use the zero product property from algebra, which basically states that you get every parenthesis and you set it equal to 0. And then you solve. So I get x equals to 8 and x equals negative 2. Now you got to be careful because a lot of people at this point, they're like, oh yes, I'm done. And they move on. But they haven't finished yet because, right now I'll go back to this little screen here. But notice what step 4 says. Plug in the x values that you solved for into the linear equation to find your y values. We got to find points, x, y's. So I got to get these x values right here. So this one here and that one there. I'm going to plug them in up there, okay? So up there meaning in my linear equation. So remember, 8 and negative 2. This is what I used to do when I used to do this in my homework. I would say, let x equals negative 8. Let x equal to 2. And then I would plug them into that equation and get my y value so I can finish. So let's plug in the negative 8 into my linear equation, okay, the easier equation. So y equals 4 times negative 8. Wait a minute, was it negative 8 or positive 8? Positive 8, I'm wrong, hold on. Forgive me here, let me fix that. That's 8 and a negative 2. Right, yeah, 8 and a negative 2. So plugging in an 8. So that's 32 plus 10, so that's 42. So then I'm going to write my answer, 8 comma 42. And there's one of my solutions, 8 comma 42. Now I'm going to do it again for x equal to negative 2. So y equals 4 times negative 2 plus 10. So that's negative 8 plus 10. That's a positive 2. So my next point is a negative 2 comma 2. And now I'm done. Okay. So I'll just kind of zoom out really quick just so you guys can see. That's the whole problem right there. Okay. We started with identifying our equations, plugging in my linear into my quadratic, solving it for 0, right? So eventually we got to 0. Choosing whether I wanted to use a quadratic formula or factoring. Again, I prefer factoring. I think it's just easier for me in my head, but your head might be a little different. You might say, I don't like factoring. I'd rather do the quadratic formula. Whatever works for you is fine. But I factored, I got my answers, and I solved for x. Once I solve for x, then I plug it back into my linear equation. You could plug it back into your quadratic if you want to, but plugging a number back into a quadratic equation versus a linear equation, there's more variables in the quadratic one. So why not take the easy road and just plug it into the linear one instead? Okay? So plug it into the linear one, find your y values, and write your point. Okay? So notice all the work that we've done, you guys know how to do, right? We've talked about it. We've either taught it to you or you learned it from before. But we've either covered it here or it's previous knowledge. So the process, though, of doing this, you may have never seen it. It just depends on who taught you. Some teachers will make sure they teach this to you. Some teachers will never teach this to you. How many of you guys have seen this type of stuff before? Linear, quadratic stuff. So this might be brand new for everybody. But yeah, so that's how you do it. But it's not that much different than just doing substitution. Just that now we have a quadratic equation versus 2 linear ones. So let's look at number 3, and then hopefully we don't run out of time on number 3. Okay, but let's look at number 3 for you guys here. So we get y equals x squared plus 7x plus 100. And then the other one is y plus 10x equals 30. First step is to identify the linear function. There it is. Because notice that one has x to the first power as the highest power. The other one has an x squared. So this has to be linear. Okay? You'll also notice that this is not solved for x or y. This one here, whereas the other one was. So I'm going to have to actually solve for either x or y. Looking at the equation, y looks like it's going to be easier to solve for because it's all by itself. So let me just subtract 10x on both sides. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 10x. And I get that y is equal to 30 minus 10x. Now, I did get a student ask me earlier. She said, what if I wanted to write negative 10x plus 30 instead of 30 minus 10x? That's correct, and that's fine. It's up to you. I just prefer not having negatives in the front if I can help it. It just looks harder, right? Like, look at this. Between these two equations, I feel like this one is easier, even though they're identical. I just personally feel like this would be an easier problem. Why? because that negative 10x in the front just makes it look like it's going to be harder to do. It's not, but it just kind of looks like it. So I always tell people, if you can avoid having negatives in the front, your mind might say like, oh, that's not that hard to do. And then you won't feel so scared to try a problem, right? So for me, I always try to leave the positive numbers in the front whenever I do substitution. So anyway, now that I solved for y, let's get this and plug it in there, just like I did in the previous problem. So notice we're just following the same steps, okay? So I'm going to put 30 minus 10x equals x squared plus 7x plus 100. Now, I'll add the 10x on both sides just to move the x first here. So plus 10x plus 10x on this side as well. So I get 30 equals x squared plus 17x plus 100. And then I'm going to move the 30 over to this side. So let's subtract 30 on both sides. Remember, I'm doing this because I have to set it equal to 0. I'm not just doing this for fun. Like, I need to set it equal to 0 or else I can't do the problem. So we get 0 equals to x squared plus 17x plus 70. Now notice 70 has factors of 10 and 7, which add up to 17. So I want to factor this. It's going to be easier for me to do it by factoring, because I already noticed what two numbers I want to use, a 10 and a 7. Okay, so let's go ahead and factor this. Let me write down my ABCs here. So A is 1, B is 17, C is 70. So A times C, that's 70 up here and a 17 down there. And I already told you that I'm going to use a 7 and a 10, right? Positive 7, positive 10. Those will work perfectly because 7 times 10 is 70. 7 plus 10 is 17. So let's go ahead and write out my solution here. From factoring, 0 equals x plus 7, x plus 10. And now I get to solve. What are my two answers? Can you guys do that in your head? Negative 7 and what else? Negative 10. Right? You don't have to always do all the steps. I just kind of looked at it and said, what plus 7 is 0? Well, negative 7 plus 7 is 0. And then for the other one, what plus 10 is 0? Negative 10 plus 10 is 0. So there you go. I found my two x values. So now I'm just going to plug them back in, right? So going back this way, go to the other side, plug it into your linear equation, which happens to be right there. Y equals 30 minus 10x. So let's write it down. Let x be negative 7. By the way, you don't have to write it the way I do. I just, when I was learning this stuff, the way my brain works, things have to be in order. Okay, that's why I think I don't like negatives in front, because it just looks odd to me. So if I see the math in order, it's easier for me to understand it. Or if I make a mistake, I can go back and check easier, right? I remember when I was like in 3rd grade and 4th grade, if this was my whole paper right here, so you guys know you have your paper like that. I tried to do 40 problems in like 3 lines. Anybody still do that? Yeah. I mean, you try to fit everything in like this much space, right? And then I realized I never knew what the heck I did because I couldn't follow my own work, right? It was all like crunched together. So, and then my brother, I don't know if you guys know this, my brother's a mathematician as well, but he was 4 years older than me. And he'd always go, he's like, you're stupid. You have a whole piece of paper. Why do you only use 2 lines? And I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, use everything. So he used to help me out because I wasn't like great at math when I was younger. So he used to help me out. And he used to tell me, if you don't start using the whole page, I'm not going to help you. So, okay, fine. So I started using the whole page. Then we got to word problems. And I didn't understand how to do word problems. And he's like, draw pictures. You like drawing, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, draw pictures. So I draw pictures. And the worst part was this. Every time he helped me, since he was 4 years older than me, he used to create like 3 extra problems off of his head. And he said, if you don't do those, I'm never going to help you again. So like, he used to bully me. Like he was my tutor, but he was my bully too. Like he's like, you better do these 3 problems or else I'm never going to help you. So I'm like, oh gosh. And I got 3 more problems. So I hated to ask him for help. because I knew I was going to get more homework. But I mean, it helped me, But yeah, take your time, organize, okay? Organize your work. So plugging in a -7 is going to look like this. That's 30 plus 70, okay? So this is 100. So here's your answer, -7 comma 100. All right, so there's that one. And then -10, let's plug that one in. So that's 30 minus, 10 times -10. Well, that's 30 plus 100, so that's 130. So you get -10 comma 130. Okay, so, and we're 1 minute away. So there you go. Those are your answers. By the way, guys,